Welcome to the History Bards podcast today. I'm host Dee Marley, along with my co-host Michael Zucker, the author of the Eisenhower Chronicles, and we'd like to welcome Sepehr Haddad to the show. Sepehr is the award-winning author of 100 Sweet Promises, which was the first place award winner from the 2022 Bookfest Awards, winner of the 2021 American Writing Awards, and finalist in the 2022 International Book Awards for Historical and Literary Fiction. He also won first place gold in the historical romance category for the 2021 Historical Fiction Company's Book of the Year contest. Sepehr is the grandson of composer Nasr Sultan, who is the director of the Iranian Conservatory of Music. He is also a Universal Music Group recording artist with the Billboard chart-topping duo of Shaheen and Sepehr. He lives in the Washington, D.C. metro area. Sepehr, how are you doing today? We are so thrilled to have you here.
Thank you very much. I appreciate the honor of being interviewed by you. Thank you.
Very, very good. We are so glad to have you on the show. And to start off with, we would love for you to tell the listeners a little bit more about your book, 100 Sweet Promises.
Yes. Well, 100 Sweet Promises is the book I wrote in 2021, published by Appleyards and Sons Publishing. And it is basically based on the true story of my grandfather, Nasr Sultan Minbashan's life, as you mentioned. And this story was told to me by my grandmother about 40 years ago, when I left Iran to come to the US for college. Right before I left, she told me this story, and it was one of those things that you just put in the back of your mind and you don't think much about it until we went on a trip to Iran, my wife and I and my kids. And during that trip, I told my wife, when we were passing my grandmother's house, that this is where my grandmother told me a story the last time I saw her. And my wife asked me, "What is this story?" And my wife also edited the book. And she said, "What is this story?" So I went ahead and explained it to her. And finally, after a few years of very deep research, I started putting pen to paper and I wrote this story.
Yeah, that's so great. Can you tell the listeners a little bit about the synopsis of it so they'll know what
Yes.
it is?
So my grandfather, my great grandfather, was the head of the Iranian Conservatory and the first person to write a national anthem for, at the time, Persia, which in 35, its year in 1935, they changed the name to Iran. The Iranians always pronounced the country Iran from thousands of years ago. Persia is just the Greeks' way of calling the Iranians because of the area in Iran called Pars or Fars, which is a area where Persepolis is, the ancient capital of Persia. And
Right.
that's why, but Iranians always have called it Iran. So in any case, my great grandfather in 1898 takes his 13-year-old son, Nasser Sultan, with him to St. Petersburg, Russia, to study music under people such as Rimsky-Korsakov and Alexander Glazunov and these type of very highly educated and well-known musical geniuses of that time. And Russia at the time for Persia was sort of like the US is now for most of the world. It was the place people wanted to go. It was the place
Yes.
to be. And so he takes his 13-year-old son. They live in Russia together for 5 years. And then my great grandfather comes back to Iran, leaves Nasser Sultan in Russia for 2 years to finalize his studies. He comes back to Iran, goes back to Russia for one more year. And during that year, he becomes the tutor of Princess Irina Romanov, which is the niece of the Tsar Nicholas II. And then a love story ensues, and the rest is I don't want to give it all away.
No, don't give it away. Don't give it away. It's too good to give away. Everybody needs to read this book, definitely. So I know learning the story about your grandfather must have really impacted you a great deal. Can you tell us about how this impacted you and motivated you to write the story?
Yes, well, it's very interesting because I never met my grandfather. So everything I knew about my grandfather was through either my mother, my uncle, which was his son, or my grandmother. And when I was told this story by my grandmother, so he became this kind of fictional character when she was telling me this story, and the story was really so amazing that I didn't know if it was really 100% true because back then there was no Google, there's no way to go
Right.
research it. I wasn't in the US to go to the Library of Congress and do deep dive research until we go on this trip to Iran in 2010, and now there is a Google. And my wife said, "You got to write this story." And I started doing
Yes.
research. And then my uncle was 100 years old. He was the Minister of Fine Arts and Culture of Iran. And so he had a number of articles and magazines written in Persian, the language of Iran, that you wouldn't even find on Google if you could research it and try to look these things up. And I'm blessed that I'm bilingual, so I can read and write in Persian. And I was able to read these articles from 60, 70, 80, 90 years ago
Oh,
and learn a lot about my great grandfather, my grandfather. And so I got to meet him basically through communications with my uncle and also reading these articles.
oh, that had to have been really, really probably gave you chills at times that you were
Well, it
able to
did.
read
And,
that.
it made me think that, if he wasn't such an important figure in the history of Persia, I would have never known about him because they
Yes,
wouldn't write any articles about him. And
right.
so my advice to young authors or any author that wants to do historical fiction based on some family relation or whatever is document as much as you can for the people that are up there in age in terms of 90s and
Yes.
hundreds and so forth. Go talk to them, record their voice, record film, ask them questions, take notes because my uncle was very instrumental. He passed away 2 years ago, but he was
Oh,
very
so
instrumental in helping me kind of figure out some stuff about my uncle that I didn't know. For example, in the book, my uncle, my grandfather, falls in love with a lady, Madame Shamsi, who's this woman who comes back from France and is very westernized for that day of Iran. It was totally in a male chauvinistic society. It was
right.
totally against, the rules, how she wanted to live her life.
Mhm.
And I didn't know about this mistress of my grandfather until my uncle told me about her. And he said that story, and I wrote it almost, her name wasn't Shamsi, of course, but I wrote it exactly like my uncle had told me.
Oh, wow. That's
Yeah.
and
And
again,
it was one page when I had written a chapter about Shiraz, which is very close to the city, to Persepolis, the ancient
mhm,
capital.
mhm.
It was maybe a page and a half. By the time I was done with what my uncle had told me and sort of writing the story, it turned into 4 chapters.
Yes. Yes. And it's great. Again, everybody, you must read this book. Michael, you
Thank
have
you.
Actually, I'm interested in asking about not just the book, but also its relationship to other, I guess, your musical career. I mean,
Yes.
did your grandfather's musical interest impact yours?
Well, the only thing, thank you. That is a very good question because I didn't know the answer to that until I started writing the book. From history, only thing I knew was my mother had told me that my grandfather had gone to St. Petersburg and had studied with Rimsky-Korsakov and the likes. And so that was a point of pride for me.
of course.
And also that my great grandfather had written the national anthem of Persia in 1909. And besides that, I never put two and two together when myself and Shaheen formed our band, Shaheen and Sepehr, which we have 5 albums on the Billboard charts. I never put two and two together that they say that it's in the genes or it's in the blood. I really never thought of that until later on when I was writing the book. I went, "Oh, my great grandfather was a musician. My
Mhm.
grandfather is a musician. My mother used to sing, and so I recorded her on some of my songs. My uncles were the one who was in the Ministry of Culture and Fine Arts, one who was a 4-star general in the army, were both violinists, pianists, and songwriters. And they
Wow.
actually had a top 10 hit in 1940s in
Oh,
Iran of a tango song they had done. And so I still had not put all of these together until I started writing this book. And then I realized, oh, wait, maybe that's where I'm getting all of this from.
Yes, of course, of course. Oh, that's truly fascinating.
Oh,
Is there anything in your research that you did that maybe that you can share that maybe you found fascinating or obscure, maybe about the Romanov family even?
Well, yes, no, it wasn't about the Romanovs.
Okay.
Actually, it was about Rimsky-Korsakov and Tchaikovsky. So I
Okay.
was very enamored with Rimsky-Korsakov, having probably heard that my grandfather and great-grandfather had studied with him. But I loved Scheherazade's suite. Everybody knows that, the
Yes.
Flight of the Bumblebee and all these beautiful
Yes.
songs. And in cartoons, they used to play a lot of this classical music in the
Yes.
old days, how the boat on
Right.
the ocean and so. And so I loved classical music and loved Rimsky-Korsakov's music. And so when I was writing this, I thought maybe instead of it even being a story about my family, I could write it more about Rimsky-Korsakov and Tchaikovsky's relationship. Because what was interesting to me is that Tchaikovsky was doing really well, and Rimsky-Korsakov was teaching at the conservatory and wasn't really writing that much music. And the interaction between the two of them, where they were friends, but they also had a little bit of, how friends are when they're competing in the same arena. They can be a little bit, pushy or a little bit,
Yeah.
no, you're not doing it right. And so Tchaikovsky kept telling Rimsky-Korsakov, what are you doing that you're just teaching, sitting there teaching and all that? You got to create, you got to write more and all that. And so that touched my heart kind of in a way because, as you are an author, so you know how it
Yes.
is when you have a story in your head, but it's hard to put the pen to paper. It's hard to start the ball rolling. And so I felt an affinity kind of with what Tchaikovsky was saying. It was like, what are you doing? Go on, start writing, it'll come, and so that was interesting to me to see the interaction between the two of them.
No, that's great. And I'm a huge I love classical music myself as well. That's what my go-to whenever I'm driving in the car anywhere. I like listening
But
to that. So that's great. Michael, do you have
yeah, I kind of want, sorry, to follow up what we were talking about a second ago. I mean, does your musical background, did it help with sort of, is kind of to put it, to get into your grandfather's head and portray him as a character?
Well, yes, because it helped me in terms of, for example, first of all, choosing one. There's a theme in this book. That's the Franz Schubert's Fantasy in D minor, and that's the song that my grandfather Nasser Sultan is teaching the young princess, and that's where they start bonding and getting close to each other because it's a song made for four hands.
right?
And when I was doing my research, I really didn't know what four hands meant. I thought four hands meant two different pianos and two people playing at the same time, the two pianos. I didn't know that four hands meant two people sitting at the same piano playing four hands until my grandmother told me that when they would sit, that her husband had told her this, that when they would sit side by side and they would play, and all of a sudden my grandfather's wrist would go on top of the wrist of Irina, that he didn't want to move his hand and she didn't want to move her hand, and his heart was beating out of his chest. And that's exactly the way I wrote this. And then I went and researched what kind of music they would play, and Nasser Sultan and his father, who had written the national anthem, would be playing Schubert four hands marches. And so that's why I put this forehand piano in the book, which actually there's an audiobook trailer that we have that actually talks about this moving hand moving. And I know you, Adi, also in your review, beautifully, you wrote this so beautifully that I wish I'd put that in my book instead. But of how that music, from the beginnings, the quiet beginnings to the crescendo at the end and so forth. And so it did help me in that way, Michael. Yes.
Yes, and that was a that was an extremely moving part of your book. That whole interaction between the two of them and him teaching her that four hands. One of my favorite parts in the book. Absolutely.
Thank you. And it's such a beautiful melody, that
Yes.
fantasy. So I listen to that almost every day. I just
Yeah.
love that. It's beautiful. Well, and because of the juxtaposition of the story where my grandfather was teaching a princess. He was a composer, so he was teaching a princess to play this. And that fantasy was written by Schubert for a countess, Caroline Esterhazy, that he was teaching, and he actually was in love with. And he
Oh,
dedicated this for her. So it was very interesting, a countess and a
yes.
princess and two composers, and both of them falling for their pupil.
And isn't it great whenever you find something like that to put in your, that just everything just melds together?
Yes, it just works together.
Absolutely. So, was there anything in particular that you found difficult about writing this book?
Yes. The Persian culture is such that almost everybody knows each other and it's very formal. So
Okay.
when I was thinking about writing, there's two scenes in here that I was having difficulty writing about. One was a gambling scene where my grandfather is gambling in one of the gaming houses, which they call voshkol in Russian. And my grandfather was a gambler. And didn't do very well when he gambled, like many gamblers. Might have thought he did well, but he didn't. And there were times when they would have to maybe sell furniture and carpets and stuff to pay the
Oh,
debts. And then there were times when furniture and carpets were coming galore because he had won a hand. So that's one story that I knew about my grandfather, and I didn't want to kind of, in a way, put it in there because I thought it might take away from his, from the type of glory that I was trying to show about
yes.
my relation. But my wife, who edited the book, said you have to put all the dirty and the clean stuff in there because it's based on a true story, and it's just what it was. It's historical fiction, but very close to true history. So you have to put it in there. That
Yes.
was one. Another was this mistress that he had, which was also the mistress of the governor of the province of Fars or Shiraz. And I didn't want to also put that in there because, you have in Persian culture, you have all these uncles and aunts and, people that knew him or knew of him. And I didn't want to, if they didn't know this stuff about him, that he had a mistress and all that. But then again, I had to put that in there because I'm writing a novel. It's,
Yes.
you have to do that. And so
Right.
luckily it didn't make much difference. No, nobody, like none of the family came to me and said, why did you write that? They actually came to me and said, oh yeah, I know he was a gambler. Oh yeah, I know about that mistress, all that. So
That's great. Michael?
Um, I was kind of interested. So, given your musical background, how, I guess, useful was that in terms of pivoting toward a new type of art form of writing a novel?
Oh, yes, yes. Well, thank you for that. First of all, writing music and writing a book are similar in that if you're trying to write a song and you have writer's block, it's the same when you're writing a book. Some days you're just flowing, the ink is flowing pages and pages, and some days you can't even write a sentence.
Yes.
And every sentence you write, you tear up and throw away, and you just say, you know what, why am I even doing this? Maybe I don't even need to write a book, that kind of thing.
Yes, we've
And the
all done
same with
that.
music, the same with music. So in that regard, they're very similar. Of course, I must admit that a book to me is much more difficult. Now, writing songs, I had a great partner that I think is a genius guitar player and a musician and a songwriter. So that eased it for me. I don't know if I had another author working with me, if that would have helped me, but you can't really in a book. It's not, it doesn't work like that, like a song, because everybody can play a different instrument. So it was much easier for writing music than I felt it was for me to write this novel. And of course, this novel, it's 300 pages and it has to be close to the story and it has to be, a song. You can listen to it for 3 or 4 minutes and you like a part, you don't like a part. You may never listen to it again. You might like to listen to it every day. A book, a 300-page book, is a different story. And to keep the reader's interest
Yes.
now, an audiobook makes it easier because you have a person who is actually a professional narrating this, and then you can add music to it and you can add links and so forth to make it more interesting. But that was one problem that I was having is that it was very difficult to transition into being a novelist for me. And second of all was the similarity was in the reviews. So when we would release an album, and it would go on the charts. Our first album went to number 6 on the Billboard charts, which shocked the record
Congratulations.
company even. and thank you. And the minute that got released, they contacted us, and we were kind of resting on our laurels a little bit. And they were saying, "Where's the second one?" And we said, "Second what?" And they said, "Second album. When this happens, you have to give one out right away," and all that
Uh-huh.
marketing type thing, kind of like books. If it's hot, while the orange hot, you have
Yes.
to. And so, but then the reviews, even though that went to Billboard, so you get maybe out of 100 reviews, you get 70, 75 that are favorable and they like it. And then there's like 20 of them that don't like it for whatever reason. And it's the same with the book reviews. When I had finished the book and released it, of course, your review gave me so much confidence when I had the review of the Historical Fiction Club, really. And then the Historical Novel Society did a review, and then
Yes.
Kirkus, and then publisher. And slowly I got confidence that even though it's my first time, maybe it isn't that bad, or whatever you think. But the people that write reviews, oh my God, when I would get like 1 star or 2 star reviews and I would read it to see why they're giving it that, and it would just upset me so much. I wouldn't care about the 50 5 star reviews. I care about those 2 1 star reviews. Like,
Yes.
didn't this person get it? But then I resolved it with myself and I realized, you know what? This person who writes that review is a consumer just like I am. When I go to a movie and I pay that ticket price, I have the right to come out of the movie and say, I didn't like it or I like it, and what are the reasons? And so all of a sudden, these reviews didn't bother me anymore as they did when we were doing music because I hadn't come to this place within myself to realize, you know what, this person has bought the right and has spent the time to read this, spent hours of their time and paid money. They should have a right to go put a 1 star, a 0 star, whatever they want there. And it shouldn't affect me. I got to do what I think is right. Now, if some people
Yeah.
like it, some people don't like it. You don't want 100% of the people giving 5 stars, then it's fake, you know.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely great advice for anybody, especially young people who are starting out in historical fiction or actually any genre, because that can kind of really set you back. And
Yeah.
but if you take that advice of looking at them like that, it's actually a way of growing.
Yes,
And yeah,
exactly.
so I think that's great. Do you actually have a favorite passage of your own from your book?
Yeah, I do. I have a favorite saying or sentence,
Okay.
which is so Nasser Sultan befriends an elderly gentleman right in the beginning of the book,
Mhm.
who's is a mentor and is a help to him. He's like an almost older brother to him. His name is Rostam Somkishvili. He's an Armenian of Georgian descent. And so they're on the train together going from St. Petersburg to Moscow. And now Sultan's going to go from there to Iran. And Somkishvili has some business dealings because he's works with the railway and iron merchant and that kind of thing. And so he turns to Nasser Sultan at some point as they're having drinks, and he says, "Divine providence is under no obligation to be kind to us all." And I just love this sentence that, and again, as an author, how it is when your character says something
Yes.
and you don't even know how it came about that he said that, but it's
Right.
so, and that has almost become a daily mantra for me to remind myself that divine providence is under no obligation to be kind to us all because, I feel so blessed in my life. But I realize that that blessing can end in a second when somebody dies or some event happens or whatever. So it makes me really try to appreciate every moment of my life. And I'm glad that Rostam said that
Yeah,
in the book.
I can't even that's incredibly profound and very beautiful. Um
Thank you. But if you want to know of a section where I really, again, and I
yeah.
sometimes read it and would cry afterwards myself, it's where Nasser Sultan is very excited about the love he has for this princess, and he's on his way back to Iran to tell his family about this great news. And he stops off to visit a friend's grave. And at that point, he meets the keeper of the graveyard, a man who's there. And this is a very young man, but he seems very just drained, energy drained, and he speaks very slowly, and he's just not a happy man. And when Sultan and him have a conversation about it, he basically says that he's destroyed because his love had left him. And now Sultan is just beaming with all of this excitement of
Yeah.
his love. And he basically gives them an answer of sort of, well, there are many more fish in the sea. You're going to find somebody who'll help you get over her, that kind of thing. And this man, the keeper, he says to him, if you believe that of love, that someone else can come and replace a love that never went away, then you have never really been in love. And I hope this never happens to you because it lives in my spine. I mean, that the sentence that he says it lives in my spine. And I just, that feeling of grief and everything that this man has. And Nasser Sultan's so on a high horse, and this man is so low. And he warns them, he says, hey, there can come a time when divine providence is under no obligation to be kind to us all. It can happen to
Yeah.
you too. So I
Yeah.
love that part of the book.
Well, you're going to make me cry. That I remember that, and again, it's so moving. And this is the reason why your book has won so many awards, because
Thank
the
you.
the effect that your words and the way you're able to describe things and really get to like that, getting to somebody's heart and living in their spine. Those are the reasons why your book has won so many awards.
Thank
Oh
you
my
so
goodness. Very touching. Very touching. Michael, you have anything?
Yeah, I actually have a couple of questions. One, I guess moving from that nice note, but to backtrack slightly to like lessons for up and coming historical fiction writers. I saw that the book had become #1 on Amazon in a couple of categories. I think it was
Yes,
Russian historical fiction and Middle Eastern historical fiction.
correct. Yes.
I guess just to ask, what steps did you take to help, the book achieve that goal?
Well, I think I had kind of a head start, even though I had never written, I had written short articles for a Persian web magazine, but just regular stories about everyday life, nothing major that got published. So, but I did have a head start in that I was a member of Shaheen and Sepehr, this band that we talked about, and so we have a big following on social
Yes.
media already. And so I think it was, and I had interviewed a lot of, especially Persian magazines and newspapers and so forth and TV, but also NPR had interviewed us on All Things Considered because of one of our last albums. We got interviewed, and that gave us a lot of publicity and a lot of reach. And so when I started writing this book and it finally got published, there was interest, first of all, from some people to see, like, well, what is he? Why is he writing a book now all of a sudden? What happened? And is it going to be even any good or not? So it got people interested. And then those same news outlets and magazines also interviewed me now for the book. So that gave it a lot of publicity.
Yes.
And then the audiobook trailers have helped us a lot because we had this gentleman who's a Tim Fearon. He's a Shakespearean voice actor in England. And we interviewed maybe 13, 14 voice actors, and they sent me samples of reading my stuff back. And it was by chance. We were about to go with someone else, and by chance, he sent in his sample, like really, I'd say 5 minutes before I was going to press the button. And his just touched me. It was just beautiful. He sounds like Gandalf in
Yes.
Lord of the Rings. He has this beautiful, just very great voice. And we were able to get some footage and to use his voice with that footage, and those audiobook trailers have really taken off. And I
Yeah.
think those audiobook trailers, especially, and also Historical Fiction Company did an audiobook trailer, was beautiful. Put it on TikTok, put it on YouTube, and those have gotten a great response. So I think that those are the things that helped the book, move up on the charts. and get us to the number one position in those two. And once you get to the number one, that's the beauty of it. You just say number
Uh-huh.
one.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. And I have to agree because I we actually listened to we also because you submitted for the contest last year for the
Yes.
audiobook category,
Yes.
and yes, he has an incredible voice. So it even
Thank you.
added even more to your story by
Thank you
listening to
very
him.
much.
Can I ask another question?
Sure.
Oh, yes, please.
Sure. You probably have been asked this by other interviewers, but it's kind of occurring to me that since the story is primarily about um, your grandfather's romance with the Tsar's niece, and it was conveyed to you by your grandmother, was she comfortable discussing it kind of in that depth?
So that's a very interesting question again. Thank you for asking that. Not only that, I've been asked that, but they've also asked me, why didn't I end the book with me talking to her again about it and saying, wow, all that.
Yeah.
And I had done that. I had done an epilogue or a last chapter that I had done that. I'd said I'd talked to her and all this. But it just felt such a right place to leave it where it was at the end of the book, those last few sentences. It's kind of like in a movie where you just want it to end there. You
Yeah.
didn't want to have another scene, and then that scene
Yes.
takes away from that climactic end.
Right.
And so my grandmother at the time, she told me this was 1978, right when martial law had happened in Iran, right before the Islamic Revolution was going to happen, a few months before that. And she told me this, and I was leaving to come to the States in a week or 10 days after that. And this was so this was probably 50 years after she had been married to him, and then he had died early. He had died at the age of 53. So this was so far removed from her, I think, in terms of time. It wasn't something very recent where you could tell that she was actually excited to tell me this story like a movie.
Yeah.
And I think one reason might have just been that, at the end of it, she realized, yeah, it was a princess and he was in love with her, but he married me and we have these five kids and we have this life together. We had this life together. So I think if there was any feeling of a jealousy, that went away because she kind of won, quote unquote, by getting him and
Yes.
having kids with him and the legacy of these kids. And then their kids did very well. As I said, one became the first minister of culture and fine arts of Iran, and the second one became the head of the Iranian armed forces. And so, their kids even did well. So, I think she didn't feel any jealous. I didn't sense any hint of jealousy or envy or anything like that.
Oh, that's good. Well, I have to say that you mentioned about a movie. You need
Oh,
this book needs to be made into a movie. It has the same kind of feel as like one of my favorite movies is Dr. Zhivago.
Well,
So it
thank you for saying that. And your review, you
yes,
said that. And I
yes,
had that in my mind as I was writing this, because as you said, he was a poet and,
right,
Lara was his love interest.
right,
And so it was very similar. It was Russia. It was,
yes,
the same time frame, very, very interesting that you caught that.
yes.
Those are kind of on the back burner now, but the
Okay.
interest was there and people were seeing the same thing that you saw, which was very, very refreshing.
Yeah. Well, I'll be the first in line if it gets
Thank you.
or like scheduling it on my TV if it comes out for sure. And I know that would be a thrill to you to see
Thank
that.
you.
Well, can you tell us anything about what you're working on now as far as maybe writing or
Yes.
even in music?
Yes, well, I'm so far with Shaheen, we've talked about doing some singles because these days in the music world, you don't do albums anymore. You basically do singles and then you release one every few months, and then that way you keep the excitement. In the old days, you'd release an album and it'd be 11 songs on there,
Yeah.
and then that's it. The album after a year, but this way you keep it uh,
Yeah.
in the public eye a little bit longer, and attention spans are much shorter now. But you have social media, so you can put snippets and so forth. Um, but regarding a book, I'm writing a second novel now. I'm basically, I think, about a third way through. And takes place again in Iran, but this is now during World War II.
Okay.
And it's a family saga, which is going to be based a bit on my dad's life. My dad passed away 2 years ago. So I went to clean up his apartment and I found 10 cassettes. He was still recording on cassettes. So finding a cassette player was a hard thing these days
Yeah.
because people don't even know what a cassette is. It's a
Right.
little tape thing. You don't have to explain it. But so I started listening to these, and these were my dad's memoirs that he wanted to one day write a book.
Oh, how about
So
that?
I listened to them. First of all, it gave me a lot of comfort because I was able to, right after he passed away, I was able to hear his voice, and I still have it, so I can hear him
Yeah.
speaking.
Yeah.
And it started giving me certain ideas. He was very descriptive, so his explanation of or the descriptions of areas and places and stuff were fantastic, which I don't think I can even find in any books. It was just his
Oh,
recollection of the streets and so forth. And so then I decided to do a kind of combination of my own life in Iran, the people I knew and so forth, experiences, and his, but place it in World War II Iran, because a lot of people, there's a lot written about World War II, but a lot of people do not know what Iran endured during World War II. Iran was
yes.
neutral in World War II, so Iran had said neither with the Allies nor with the Axis, but the Allies needed Iran in order to get shipment of food and ammunition to the Russians.
Yes.
So they basically attacked Iran and occupied Iran, the British and the Russians, in 1941. They bombed Iran, they killed a lot of people, and this created a economic nightmare. Plus, this happened during the harvest of 1941, and they had taken over all the distribution channels in terms of trucks and train and so forth for taking stuff for the troops in Russia. So they took the food distribution system in Iran was all messed up. So you had a quarter of the population of Iran die from starvation and disease. 4 million people died.
Oh,
Nobody knows that. At the time,
no.
Iran only had 16 million. And so a quarter of the population died. So this book takes place during that time when the Russians and the British have occupied it in two different zones and they're sending shipments up there. And the Germans are looking to disrupt that supply chain by maybe some terrorist acts on the railway, sending in agents. And then, as you know, the Tehran conference in 43 was Churchill, Stalin, and Roosevelt. And the Germans actually had hatched a plan to try to assassinate the big three in Tehran.
Oh, oh,
So it's a very interesting, mix of all these things. It's the Persian culture again, and then it's the
yeah.
historical World War II events, and then also the international, intrigue.
And where are
So
you? Like, when are you expecting that to be out?
I'm hoping to have it published next March,
Okay,
by
great.
next March. Yeah,
Okay.
so I
Well,
have time.
yes, and we'll definitely be right behind you
Well, thank you
in
so much.
promoting that for
Thank you. I
sure.
appreciate that.
I have to say, your family and your background, your history with your family and everything is truly fascinating. I have enjoyed every minute of reading your book and getting to know
Thank you.
you.
Thank you very much. Thank you so
Absolutely.
much.
We really appreciate you being on the show today.
Thank you. It was an honor for me. I really mean this from the bottom of my heart. I thank you both for taking the time out to interview me.
Absolutely. We had such a great privilege in reviewing Sepehr's book, and you can go to our website and read the review for this 5-star book, and we'll put the link in the description. And we are so excited, and we wish you much success on this and your future books, as well as your music career. And we will definitely put a link for that on our website as
Thank
well.
you. Thank
Yes,
you
for
very
sure.
much. I appreciate that. Thank you so much.
Yes. And you can go to Sepehr's website at www.sepehrhaddad.com. And don't forget to subscribe to the podcast, as next week's episode, we are thrilled to host historical author Lindsay Farah. Thank you so much to our listeners and viewers. This is Dee Marley and
Michael Zucker.
we ask you to keep making history and keep listening.